So today I wanted to talk about different ways that we can help prevent injuries with like the functional fitness training stuff that we do here and kind of in our everyday lives. So I think most of you know me, but for those who don't, I'm Dan Dallator. I'm a physical therapist. This is my beautiful wife, Abby, who's here today with us. This is my company, Infinite Capacity Physical Therapy. I do a lot of work here out of the gym. I'm a member here at Maniac, and I also do some teaching at UNE with the PT program there. So whenever we talk about injury prevention, no injury is always 100% preventable. So really what we're going to be talking about is injury risk reduction, ways that we can reduce the risk of certain injuries and the things that we do. So this is an injury prevention pyramid that was proposed by a guy named Coles, who is I think he's an athletic trainer for the San Antonio Spurs. And kind of in his world, the base of the pyramid down here kind of revolves around player recruitment, who they're going to be drafting and that kind of thing, but not really realistic in our world. So I like to kind of change that base with nutrition and purposeful recovery. Similar to the CrossFit pyramid, I think that nutrition and other lifestyle factors kind of needs to be at that base. So let's go ahead and start there and look at different ways that nutrition and certain other things and lifestyle factors can influence injury prevention. So nutrition could be a whole seminar in and of itself, but I just want to talk about three important concepts real quick. Rehydration, repairing damaged tissues, and replenishing energy stores. So rehydration obviously is going to be through water intake. Most adults need around 3 liters, which is about 12 cups or 3 quarts of fluid each day as our baseline. We get about 1 liter of that from some of the foods that we eat, so we need to be drinking at least 2 liters, 8 cups or 2 quarts from drinking water. In general, we sweat around 1/2 to 2 liters for every hour of activity, so we need to be replenishing that as well on top of it. And some things that can happen if we're not hydrated enough, even a 0.5% reduction in our hydration results in increased strain on our heart and cardiovascular system. A 1% decrease in hydration results in decreased aerobic endurance. And you can see some of the other effects there too. I'm going to try to turn that off. Thank you. Okay, so repairing damaged tissues is the way that we're going to battle that is by our protein intake. So just in general, for building or maintaining our muscle mass that we already have, we need to take in between 0.6 to 1.35 grams of protein per pound of our body weight per day. And that's going to kind of be dependent on our activity levels, our goals, our sex. And then typically before and after exercise, within about a 4 to 6 hour window of each other, we want to be taking in 0.25 grams per pound of body weight. And that's based on a couple of studies that looked at nutrient timing around of when we work out. And they found that there's that 4 to 6 hour window, and it's kind of on a sliding scale. So if you eat, say, your 0.25 grams of protein per pound of body weight 2 hours before you work out. Then you have about 4 hours to take in that 0.25 again. But if you say you exercise fasted and you didn't eat anything before, then you want to take in that 0.25 plus the 2.5 that you missed before in a shorter amount of time. And then replenishing energy stores is all about carbohydrates. So with this, the timing isn't as important for most of us who are just working out once a day. As long as we eat the amount that we need to replenish those stores, then we should be good to go. There are some different rules and things around if you're working out multiple times a day or doing a competition, something like that. But for most of us, what we want is between 5 and 7 grams, 5 and 7 grams per kilogram of body mass if we do moderate exercise 1 hour a day, which kind of breaks down to about 2.5 to 3.5 grams per pound of body weight. Or a little bit more, about 3 to 5 grams per pound of body weight if we're doing moderate to high exercise for 1 to 3 hours a day. Okay, so what kinds of different purposeful recovery techniques do you guys know about or use? There's a ton out there, but I think some of the most important ones that I'm going to talk about today is sleep. So what we're finding is that things like sleep quality, physical activity, and emotional regulation, like being able to handle stress, all kind of work together. This is from a certain study that found that both sleep quality and physical activity together can have big effects on our ability to regulate emotions, and vice versa. Our ability to regulate our emotions has impacts on both our sleep quality and our physical activity. So one of these things kind of gets out of whack, and it can kind of snowball and lead to some detrimental effects. So for sleep, adults need at least 7 hours. Children need more. And a good rule of thumb is that if you don't feel awake after 30 minutes without caffeine, then you're probably sleep deprived. Okay, so moving on up the pyramid to load monitoring. So load monitoring involves being able to kind of track the load that we put on our tissues. So tissue capacity is the amount of load an individual is able to withstand during functional activities. Injury is whenever we exceed the capacity of those tissues. And full tissue capacity is when an individual is able to perform functional movements at the volume and frequency required without exacerbating symptoms or causing tissue injury. So we can build tissue capacity with gradual overload by progressing intensity and complexity of movements specific for that tissue and region. This includes progression to maximal loading. So we can increase our tissues and an individual's capacity for load by progressively loading it. But with increases in load, we run the risk of overuse and injury. So it's kind of a paradox known as the training injury prevention paradox. High loads lead to better fitness, but high loads can also lead to overuse injury. But low loads can also lead to less adapted tissues, which can also potentially lead to injury. So how do we progressively load our tissues without running the risk of injuries? So a couple studies, including some by the International Olympic Committee, find that a fine balance exists between training, detraining, and overtraining. And evidence has emerged that load management is a major risk factor for preventing these injuries. So whenever we talk about load monitoring, what we're really looking at is maximal recoverable volume, if anybody's heard of that before. So what we don't want is volume below our maximal recoverable volume, because that's going to result in detraining. We don't want loads significantly over our maximal recoverable volume, because that can lead to injury. So what we want is kind of an average right around that maximal recoverable volume. And the research is kind of showing it this way. So what we found is that there's a sweet spot for load. So if this is likelihood of injury, and this is what's called acute to chronic workload ratio, we want our ratio to be between 0.8 and 1.3. As you can see, if we don't load enough, so we're below our maximal recoverable volume, then that injury likelihood increases a little bit. And if we get out here past 1.5 into the danger zone, then that increases our likelihood for injury as well, okay? So this is a little Excel spreadsheet that I've built to kind of track this acute to chronic workload ratio. And this is some math, but it involves your most recent week of training compared to your previous 3 to 4 weeks of training. So your previous training is kind of like a glimpse of what our bodies are prepared for now compared to what we've done in the last week or so. So if we did a lot more in the last week compared to what our average was for the previous 3 weeks, then that's going to make our ratio really high, and vice versa. So I just kind of plug in these numbers for each day and the past several weeks, and then it gives us some of those acute to chronic workload ratio numbers. Obviously in the green is in that sweet spot, and in the red is in some of those danger zones. And then we can also get an idea for what we want that load to be for the next week to keep us in that healthy ratio. Another way that we can monitor total loads on our body is through heart rate variability. So I'm sure a bunch of you, if you don't have one, have seen people wearing the Whoops. One of the big numbers that they get a lot of their data from with Whoop is heart rate variability. And what heart rate variability is looking at the time between individual heartbeats. And Whoop measures it whenever you're at rest or sleeping. So believe it or not, the amount of time between each individual heartbeat varies a little bit. It's never completely consistent. And that's what we want. The more inconsistent that is, the better. Because what this really is a measure of our nervous system's control of our heart rate. There's two kind of systems that control our heart rate. The sympathetic system, which is known for fight or flight, like whenever we're all amped up and need to go right now. And the parasympathetic, which is for rest and recovery. What we want is those two systems to kind of be battling back and forth, and that's where that variability comes from.
We want a higher number?
We want a higher number. Whenever one of those systems, fight or flight, say we're under increased stress for some reason, or rest and recovery, our body's in a state of repair, then these numbers decrease because the one system's taking over. And that might be a sign that our body's not ready to handle increased stress from training, if that makes sense. So a couple years ago now, I think, Whoop put out a bunch of data from CrossFit athlete Sam Dancer from back in 2017. So he began using Whoop as a tool while he trained for the 2017 games. We find some interesting stuff from his data. So the CrossFit Open that year took place over 5 weeks from February 23rd through March 27th. During this time, he spent lots of time resting and using the open workouts as his heavy workouts each week. So we can see kind of like mid to late February here through mid to late March. There's a nice upward trend, higher increased variability of his heart rate. Regionals took place May 26th through May 28th. And leading up to that, I think he said that he was doing lots of traveling. His training regimen wasn't as kind of consistent. And 2 weeks before regionals, he suffered a pec strain. So I think this was the year that there were ring dips in one of the workouts. So whenever that was announced, all the athletes started heavily loading ring dips into their training, and there were a bunch of pec strains suffered. So his pec strain was about March 14th, right there. So again, we can see back through here, he had that nice steady increase, kind of leveled off average, and then he saw a big dip that maintained up until that pec strain. So again, HRV is another measure that we can use to kind of let us know, along with some of the other load monitoring, acute to chronic workload ratio stuff, how ready our body might be to take on high amounts of strain. So some different options for measuring heart rate variability. There's Whoop. It's about $30 a month. Another app, which is a one-time fee. The last I checked, it was $9.99. It might have gone up to $14.99, but it's one and done. And what it does is it uses your phone's camera and the flash, and you kind of cover your finger over the flash and the camera, and it measures your heartbeat that way, and then gives you your heart rate variability number.
Say that word.
Photoplethysmography. And this is a screenshot from that app. And yeah. Yeah, I'm recording it right now, I think. Yes. Yep. And the Elite HRV app, if you already have a compatible heart rate monitor, the app is free. So what we don't want is this, a downward trend, okay? So based on our load and recovery, what we want is to be able to recover enough that we get a little base bump in our base capacity, not a downward trend and decreased ability to prevent injuries. So let's move on to athletic development and movement efficiency. And this is the area where our coaches kind of excel, right? They know how to increase our athletic development, and they're kind of movement experts in the things that we do in here. So athletic development, ultimately individuals who are not strong enough or not fit enough to cope with the demands of their sport will eventually break down. So what we want is to build quality mobility, strength, and conditioning. So let's start with mobility. First thing I want to cover is that flexibility and mobility are not the same thing, okay? Flexibility is simply available range of motion at a joint, okay? Mobility is efficiently being able to use that available motion through performing functional movements, okay? I can have all the range of motion in the world in my shoulder, but if I can't effectively use it and control that, then it's no good to me. Stretching alone does not increase mobility, Stretching increases flexibility and available range of motion for a short period of time. Loading through that range of motion increases strength and control required for long-term changes in our mobility. And then kind of the idea behind proactive versus reactive mobility. So I don't know if you guys saw, this was on my whiteboard a couple weeks ago. And to me, reactive mobility is kind of coming in, seeing what the workout is on the whiteboard, and being like, oh crap, my squat mobility sucks. Squats are on there today. I better start warming that up, right? Versus knowing that your squat mobility sucks for some reason, finding out what it is about it, whether it's your ankles, your hips, etc., and then consistently working to improve that mobility for your squat so that you can come in, see that squats are on the whiteboard for the workout, be like, all right, I got this now, and not having to worry about it so much. The muscle strengthening, three primary factors needed to strengthen our muscles: mechanical tension, muscle damage, and metabolic stress. Proper manipulation of training variables is essential for maximizing exercise-induced muscle hypertrophy or growth, getting stronger. And CrossFit is excellent, obviously, at switching up these variables consistently. Intensity, volume, exercise selection, rest intervals, going to muscle failure, and then repetition speed. And this is what we are looking for, similar to that other graph. So we have our capacity, our base level, and whenever we put load on our tissues, we're gonna see a slight decrease in capacity at first, but then with recovery, we see what's called supercompensation, or a bump in that capacity level. If we were to not load it again, then we would eventually see a return back down to our baseline. But if we apply another load at just the right time, then we get another little bump, and then another little bump. We want that upward trend that way in our overall capacity for tissues and ourselves as individuals. Movement efficiency. Again, something that CrossFit does an excellent job of promoting: mechanics, then consistency, and then intensity. So efficient movement patterns go hand in hand with improved athletic development. In a holistic approach, of course, concurrent time should be spent to improve each. And teaching that is a skill that many physical therapists and strength coaches possess. So again, listen to your coaches, what they have to say, and be coachable around this movement efficiency stuff. From another study, fundamental movement skills are essential for participation in physical activity and mitigating the risk of injury, which are both key elements of health throughout life. And if we look at some of the stuff that's just involved in a single front squat, there's a ton of mobility requirements needed: ankle dorsiflexion, lateral ankle tibial translation, which is needed to kind of move those knees out as we're squatting, knee bend, hip external rotation to push those knees out. We need thoracic extension to keep those elbows up, and shoulder external rotation, elbow flexion, and wrist extension to get into that front rack position. As far as coordination and movement efficiency go, we need to be able to have that hip hinge and knee bend simultaneously. We need to be able to control our low back and pelvis so that we don't get that butt wink at the bottom. And we need thoracic extension control to be able to keep those elbows up throughout the whole motion. And then obviously strength. We need strength throughout our legs, our low back, our thoracic spine, and our shoulders. So a lot of stuff going on with just one motion. Structured injury prevention programs moving up the pyramid. So this is the space where I love to be in, working with people to supplement their training to reduce the risk of these training-related injuries. And we can kind of address all levels of the pyramid during these prevention programs. So this is another spreadsheet that I made, and it's a bunch of different measures everywhere from potentially the neck down to the ankles, based on a bunch of different studies that I've found over the years talking about decreasing injury risk. For example, this is one where they measured a bunch of different things in people's lower extremities. And what they found was that hip external rotation strength less than or equal to 20.3% of their body weight, or hip abduction strength less than or equal to 35.4% of their body weight resulted in increased risk of ACL tears. So these are a couple of things that we can measure, end up getting numbers for, and if there's a problem there, then we can work to improve those numbers to help decrease injury risk.
So is this like a screen that you take us through, like different movements
Yep.
and everything, and then you can figure out?
Yeah, so it's everywhere from range of motion and shoulder strength down to some functional movements like a single leg squat. And based on the numbers that we get with each of those, again, kind of like that acute to chronic workload ratio one. If the numbers pop out green, then they're good. If the numbers pop out red, then those are things that need work to help decrease the likelihood of injury of that body region. So my injury prevention programs kind of revolve around my membership option. And those membership visits can consist of anything from getting people set up for that weekly load monitoring, acute to chronic workload ratio stuff, doing those injury risk screens like I just showed, doing some corrective exercises to decrease the injury risk, doing personalized mobility programming, talking about purposeful recovery and things that you guys can be doing here in the gym, or if you feel like you just need a day of manual recovery interventions, video analysis of different lifts, doing accessory strength programming, and talking about things like nutrition, sleep, emotion regulation, or if an injury pops up, then moving into kind of rehabbing that. But hopefully, through addressing a bunch of this other stuff, if an injury ever pops up, then we'll be able to bounce back quicker from that injury. Which moves us into injury assessment and rehab. So this is typically where people will get physical therapy involved in the pyramid, right? Way up here near the top instead of somewhere down in here to prevent the injuries. And usually there's something going on further down in the pyramid somewhere. So this is where we do a full personalized assessment in order to identify which of those areas need intervention, whether it's load management, strength and mobility, lifting or skill mechanics assessment, or addressing lifestyle factors. Rehab involves finding and fixing the issue and then systematically increasing that tissue's capacity in order to progress back to the prior level of function. And me personally, as a PT, I will almost never tell somebody to stop training while working together. We just might need to kind of alter the load or the movement until we can increase that irritated tissue's capacity back to be able to do what we were doing before. And then finally, at the top of the pyramid, luck. Because injuries, again, are never 100% preventable. But if we apply some of the correct principles, then we can significantly decrease risk by systematically increasing those tissues' capacities. And these are a couple of quotes that I love revolving around risk. Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. And I find that the harder I work, the more luck I have. So if we do things and prepare, then we might just have a bit more luck in our injury prevention. And what we're really trying to do is increase our resilience. Resilience is the capacity to prepare for disruptions, recover from shocks and stresses, and adapt and grow from disruptive experience. So some key takeaways. We need to smartly monitor training loads to increase them appropriately. We need to participate in purposeful rest and recovery. We need to have the appropriate strength and mobility to perform the activities that we want to. Our mechanics need to be solid in order to appropriately disperse the stresses placed on